Okay, so today we'll start a new topic called Introduction to Productivity Efficiency Analysis. Okay, so there will be this lecture and the next two lectures and the next two tutorials. So this lecture is based on many works that I've done with many different co-authors who I dearly respect and acknowledge here. And what we'll do is, as you can see from this title, it's introduction. Introduction because there are so many topics here that one could do a full course on it. In fact, we have a full course here at UQ, and even that course doesn't cover even half of what can be covered in a sense that would be useful for researchers. So we'll do just the introduction. But even that introduction, I think, is already very useful as a foundation, as a stepping stone that will help you to progress and learn this on your own or with additional courses and so on. Okay, so let me see. So let's start with the introduction of this introduction. Okay. First, I would like to motivate a little bit and give you a little bit of background why this is important. You might have seen this interesting phrase saying that productivity is not everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. This phrase is from a famous book by a famous economist called Paul Krugman, 1997 book, which is still very relevant and one of the best books in economics. And what he meant is that if you look at any economic theory model or any applied analysis about the prosperity of some firms relative to others, some people relative to others, or some countries relative to others, at the end of the day, what matters is productivity. There are many details in theoretical models and so on, but they all boil down into productivity. So if one person is more productive than others in terms of what they can do with the same resources, then usually in the long run will make them more prosperous, other things being the same. Okay, same thing about countries. If country is more productive than others, it will be more prosperous, other things being the same. Okay, of course, there are many reasons for why a country can be productive, better institutions and these kind of things, or for firms why they're more productive. Could be because they are using optimization models better, more effectively, more precise. They studied this kind of courses in optimization and operations research, economics, management, science, econometrics better than others. And as a result, they're able to use those models better, optimize the results, find better solutions. And at the end of the day, they will perform better. Okay. Of course, there is also some part of luck, but on average, they should perform better. And you can see this in many theoretical models and many empirical studies as a confirmation. Another important phrase that you might have heard already is this: if you can't measure, you can't manage. Or you can put it in a positive way: if you want to manage, you need to know how to measure. Okay? So these two phrases, productivity is not everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And if you want to measure something, you need to know, if you want to manage something, you need to know to measure, which is attributed to famous management science professor and consultant Peter Drucker. These two quintessential phrases are the foundation for this topic and also foundation for this literature on productivity and efficiency analysis. So what we will do, we will be asking question, how shall one measure productivity? And in particular, what are the good theoretical measures from the point of view of theory? And what are the good point estimates of those measures, productivity and efficiency? And what are the good interval estimates. Okay. So let's now look at this in a little bit more detail from a philosophical or conceptual perspective. First, we want to distinguish these two notions that are often used interchangeably: productivity versus efficiency. So what is the difference? Now, productivity, there are many measures, many details, but at the end of the day, it boils down to a simple notion that typically refers to how much output is produced from given inputs. Okay? In the simplest case of one output, one input situation, for example, we have one output, let's say GDP or aggregate output could be, and one measure of labor. We can use this measure called labor productivity. That's the simplest, very intuitive, and you must have seen it in many discussions. Let's see, is this? That's right. So in many discussions in the literature or in the newspapers, that's what's often used. But it's very simple and kind of naive. It's very useful sometimes, but sometimes it can be misleading, in particular because it ignores other factors that have been used for producing the same thing. This could be capital, materials, land, energy, and so on and so forth. Okay. And for this reason, other measures came around, were proposed in the literature, very big literature, as we will see. And often they're called multi-factor productivity indexes. And we will see some examples of those. Okay. Now, those were all about productivity. What about efficiency? Now, efficiency is a very general concept. Here in this course, we're talking about productive efficiency. Okay. We talked about some other efficiency in other lectures, but in this lecture, we will be talking about productive efficiency. Okay? And even there are different types of efficiency we will see. It could be technical efficiency, it could be allocative efficiency, it could be revenue efficiency, cost efficiency, profit efficiency, many efficiency measures. Okay, but all of them are basically taking the notion of productivity and putting it into a relative perspective. So efficient, when I hear the word efficiency, that means immediately it's related to something, relative to something. What is that something? Usually it should be some benchmark chosen relative to which we want to measure that efficiency, okay? This could be a theoretical benchmark, some theoretical optimal level, like those levels that we've studied in the previous lectures, when we optimize a linear programming problem or some other problem and find an optimal or best solution, and then we can see actual solution, and we can compare one to the other, divide actual by the maximal or the optimal, and we get a natural efficiency measure. And that's exactly what we will be doing in one way or another. Okay. It can also be done relative to observed or estimated best practice, because sometimes we have theoretical optimal. Sometimes we have estimates from engineers that say that's the maximum that can be obtained from this pump or from this press or from this turbine or something like that. But often production processes are more complicated and we do not necessarily know the optimal level. We can have estimates of that. And sometimes those estimates are based on the observed best practice, on what we see, what other firms, other making units are producing, and we can find the best and relate to that best. That's what we call best practice, relative to best practice. Okay. Now, this is kind of very general, but conceptual, important setting of the stage. And before going into details, I also wanted to mention that there is a huge literature on this, right? If I wanted to use the meme, some kind of one photo, one picture that demonstrated, I would use this picture which I call, it's somewhere from the internet I found, which I call drinking from the fountain of knowledge. That's how I would say it would look like. If you try to learn this, they will probably feel like this guy. Huge amount of information, and you need to somehow be able to get what you need, right? And so that's basically what I will try to do, a little bit of that during this lecture. But what I try to do, it was not possible. What was possible took 15 years, and that's that book that I was mentioning, written jointly with Robin Sickles, 2009, which we wrote for 15 years. And there we try to summarize the kind of the most important methods, the most popular, the most commonly used in practice, okay? In some detail, but of course not all the details, with a lot of references that we give where further details can be found. So I recommend, but you don't need to buy it. You can just download it from libraries. Most libraries have it. UQ library certainly has it. And before that, if you want to have an easier reading, kind of light reading, I would recommend this article that I wrote more recently than the book. And it was in 2023, written in 22 basically, but came out in 23, still quite fresh, where you can see on the historical roots, the foundations and trends and perspective about this productivity and efficiency analysis. Okay? I will, in the next few minutes of the lecture, I will refer to this in a bit more details and use some information. So let me first kind of guide you through this book if you want to read it in more details. So chapter 1, 2 focuses on production theory, covers primal and dual. I would recommend reading it if you really want to be good in this area. And chapter 3, 7 talks about now then measurement of efficiency or productivity. And it's connected to these first two chapters. And then part 3 is dedicated to efficiency, to data development analysis. That's what we will spend most of the time in this lecture and the next two lectures. Part 4 is about alternative method called stochastic frontier analysis. We will not cover this, but if you are interested with the information you obtain in this small but very intensive course, you will be able to understand a lot of material of this if you also have a good knowledge of econometrics. And then part 5, you can use that for getting the data, the software. In fact, for your project that you want to do, you can use some of that data if you want, or you can use any other data. Okay? So let me now talk a little bit about this field, and this is based on that article in Journal Productivity Analysis. Basically, this field, because it was so important, as Paul Krugman mentioned, it's almost everything in the long run. Many scientists focused on this, and basically it became a multidisciplinary field that combines economics, operations research, management science, which includes mathematical programming or applied mathematics, statistics and econometrics, and also computer science more recently, with their machine learning and then artificial intelligence things that try to integrate all this methodology into there. Okay? Now, perhaps a good things to notice for those who from UQ should be happy that UQ is actually one of the best in this field in the world, and that's mainly because of great colleagues that we have here that contributed a lot to this literature. So you can check this, by the way, here. Right now, it used to be even in top 2, top 3, recently top 5, because there are many other universities and organizations like IMF, World Bank, and NBR. They went to the top of the list. But UQ is still in top 5 in the world. So that's still pretty strong, pretty good. Okay, so in other words, it's the best place. UQ is the best place if you want to learn this literature, this topic. But of course, there are also many other places where you can learn it as good or maybe even better. So a little bit more about the history. So the first question, where does this topic begin? Probably it begins somewhere not so far since when humanity started, because productivity is so important thing. In fact, if humanity was not productive, it wouldn't have survived, right? So because it survived, it means that it cared about productivity in many respects. But of course, more recently, productivity as a field of science, of study, is more recent, is younger. It's certainly younger than economics. Yes, younger than economics. And one of the good articles I would recommend to read is this article by Zvi Grilichis in '96 Journal of Economic Literature, which talks about the recent origins of this field. And he refers to this paper by Copeland and Martin in NBER discussion paper, which I recommend to read. And then you will also read discussions in that paper by Simon Kuznets and Milton Friedman, both were Nobel laureates. Very interesting. I talk a bit more about this in this paper if you're interested. So I'll leave it for you to read if you are interested. But there are many other scholars, of course, besides these famous ones, and many of them also received Nobel Prize at some point, like Leontiev and Higgs, Solov, Dipru, Kantorovich, Friedman, Koopmans, Farrell didn't get Nobel Prize, but also made a great contribution. We'll discuss about this. Grilichis, Junkins, and so on. Okay. Unfortunately, most of this passed already, but there are many others who are continue contributing, and I will list them here if you're interested. And whenever you read the literature, you will recognize their names, and many others. So I didn't mention all of them, of course, but you can see more in this paper. Okay. So if you're interested in most cited papers, this is again from that JPA paper that I just mentioned. You can see, and if you're interested, look at the titles, especially when you do a project, see if something excites you, and then you can try to leverage on those papers. Okay. Now, if you want to see the network, and that's also in that paper I presented and discussed a little bit, that's how you can see a lot of studies have been done this based on citation, how they cite each other and so on. So if you're doing the literature review these days, these kind of tools are very useful to see how different papers are interconnected, okay, in different literature. So you can see more of this in that paper. Now let's talk about concept of efficiency. So far, we mainly talked about productivity, but then distinguished a special case of it, which is called productive efficiency. Okay, and let's talk about how this concept of efficiency, how it is related to the concept of rationality. Like we know that in economics, most models assume that firms or the people that operate those firms are rational. And as a result, they are kind of presumed that they are efficient. Now, in reality, is that really the case? Now, the reality is quite different. Often we see some firms are more efficient than others, or some people are more efficient than others, or more productive relative to others, right? We see it all the time. Sometimes we call them frontier firms. That's how we will call them here. We also know, look at Wikipedia, for example, or some other sources. For a quick look, you can see the ranking of countries, right? So we see some countries perform better than others. But even those that perform best probably are still inefficient relative to where they could be, right? So we see that the reality is very different from the assumption of everyone is efficient or everyone is a frontier. Most likely no one is on the frontier, but maybe some are on the best practice frontier. And then we can measure efficiency relative to that best practice frontier. Okay. Another kind of memorable quote that I found and would like to give to you about rationality versus efficiency is referring to a book by another Nobel laureate, Richard Thaler and Cass Sustained. They very nicely described in the entire book, but in particular this quote, why some people could be irrational or behaving as if they are rational. Let me read it for you. Individuals make pretty bad decisions, in many cases because they do not pay full attention in their decision making. They make intuitive choices based on heuristics. They don't have self-control. They are lacking in full information, and they suffer from limited cognitive abilities. So very, very concise and precise description of why people could be behaving as if they are not rational, unlike assumed in economic theory models. Okay, so that's this book. Now, even earlier, another greatest scientist, perhaps one of the greatest scientists of all times, Isaac Newton, physicist, also gave descriptions why we could see a lot of irrationality. As I recently learned here, I knew this phrase for a long time, but recently I learned that apparently he said this phrase when he was trying to play on the stock market with his great knowledge of physics, which were probably among the best those days. He thought he would be able to figure out how to make money in the stock market. And he was trying to buy some stocks and apparently lost a lot of money because his calculations were showing they should go up, but they went down, down, and down. And at that time, people asked him, how come that you're so smart and you didn't win on the stock market? And he said, well, I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. So this is a very concise phrase, basically meaning the same thing. It's very hard to explain what exactly is happening. And theoretical model, economic theory models, they make the assumption, just the assumptions that, okay, everybody is efficient just to be able to find the equilibrium, to find the solution. But the reality is not like that. That does not mean that those economic theory models are useless. No, they're very useful to find that benchmark, to find that maximum, where the optimal, where the economy should end up or where the firm should be. And then relative to that, we can measure the efficiency, okay? At least it provides the benchmark. And we will use that, you will see today. And then we will be decomposing, and also on the next lecture, you will see that a lot. Okay, but we will be more realistic. We will not be assuming that everybody is efficient. We will say that, yeah, if everybody is efficient, then the frontier exists. And we try to estimate that frontier. But in reality, we don't require everybody being on the frontier. And after we estimate the frontier, we will be able to measure efficiency relative, or the distance relative to that frontier. Okay? Now the question is how to measure productive efficiency. Basically, one can say there are three most popular approaches, very wide approaches. Each of them have a lot of sub-approaches. The first one, and that's what we will focus on this lecture and the next two lectures, is what we call envelopment estimators. That's most popular of this is data envelopment analysis, or DEA. And now there is free disposal hull, or FDH analysis. That's basically a special case of DEA. We'll see that later. The second approach is called stochastic frontier analysis, or SFA, as econometricians like that approach. And there are three types there: parametric, semi-parametric, and non-parametric. Okay, there's a great potential. So if you want to do some research there, you can exploit that potential and develop there something. Okay, and then there is a hybrid of these approaches, hybrid of DEA or FDH with SFA. And one of them is what we call the stochastic DEA or stochastic FDH. Okay. Now, again, in these 3 lectures, we'll just focus on the first one, the envelopment estimators, but you are encouraged to take a book, the one that I pointed out, or any other book, or even articles, and try to learn other approaches. And you're always welcome to ask questions if you have. And I'll try.